He spent $2 million on the perfect wedding, hired 300 guests, and stood at the altar realizing not a single person in that room actually knew him. David Chen's wedding looked like something from a billionaire's fantasy. Crystal chandeliers casting rainbows across imported Italian marble floors, 75,000 roses flown in from Ecuador that morning, champagne fountains flowing with Dom Perignon that cost more per bottle than most people earn in a week, and a bride so beautiful that photographers fought for position to capture her from every angle. But if you looked closely past the designer tuxedos and couture gowns, past the 12-piece orchestra playing Vivaldi with surgical precision, past the ice sculptures shaped like swans and the 5-tier wedding cake that required structural engineering to prevent collapse, you'd see something profoundly disturbing. On the groom's side of the ceremony, 3 chairs occupied by his corporate lawyer, his accountant, and his chief financial officer, men paid handsomely to manage his wealth but who couldn't tell you his favorite food or the name of his childhood dog or whether he preferred sunrise or sunset. On the bride's side, 17 bridesmaids in matching blush silk, 47 family members dabbing theatrical tears, and over 100 friends genuinely celebrating Victoria's triumph of landing a tech billionaire whose net worth had been profiled in Forbes 3 months earlier. David stood there adjusting his custom brioni tie for the 7th time, hands trembling not from joy, but from the suffocating realization that he'd constructed an elaborate performance of connection while being utterly, devastatingly alone. The officiant spoke about love and commitment and building a life together, words that echoed hollow in a room filled with people who were there for the spectacle, the networking opportunities, the Instagram content, the premium open bar, anything except the man making vows he wasn't sure he understood anymore. Victoria smiled beside him with practiced perfection, her 3 million follower Instagram audience watching via carefully positioned live stream cameras. But David caught her glancing at her phone between vows, checking engagement metrics even during what should have been the most meaningful moment of their lives together. Then his eyes drifted to the back corner of the ballroom, deliberately positioned away from the photographer's sightlines, and he saw her. His sister Emma, sitting alone in her wheelchair, wearing a simple dress she'd designed herself, the only person in that lavish room who knew that David's middle name was James, that he used to be terrified of thunderstorms until age 9, that he once cried for 3 hours when their childhood dog died, that he used to be human before he decided humanity was too expensive to maintain. She wasn't crying tears of joy like the paid guests were instructed to do for the video footage. She was just watching with eyes that held something far more devastating than anger. Profound sadness, mixed with recognition of exactly who her brother had become and what it had cost him to get there. If you want to know how a man becomes so successful he can afford anything except genuine connection, and what happens when the one person who really knows him forces him to see the truth he's been running from, hit that like button and subscribe, because what unfolds next will shatter everything David thought success meant. David Chen wasn't always a man who measured relationships in terms of return on investment. There was a time when he was just a kid from a working-class neighborhood in Queens, who shared a bunk bed with his little sister Emma, and dreamed not of billions, but of simply making enough money so his parents wouldn't fight about bills every Sunday night. Emma was 3 years younger, all energy and grace even as a toddler, the kind of child who turned living rooms into stages and hummed constantly like she carried her own soundtrack. By age 7, she was taking ballet classes at a community center, paid for by their mother who cleaned houses to afford the $30 monthly fee, and David would walk her there and back every Tuesday and Thursday, doing his homework on hard plastic chairs while she practiced pirouettes with fierce concentration. He became her protector, her champion, the one who told bullies at school that his sister was going to be famous someday, and they'd regret every mean word. When Emma was accepted into a prestigious ballet academy at 15 with a full scholarship, David was 17 and working 2 jobs to help cover her additional costs for pointe shoes and performance fees that the scholarship didn't include. He'd arrive home at midnight from his shift at a warehouse, count out bills for Emma's next competition entry, then sleep 4 hours before school. Their parents were proud but overwhelmed. immigrants who worked themselves to exhaustion just to keep the family housed and fed. So David became Emma's primary support system, attending every recital, filming every performance on a phone with a cracked screen, believing with absolute certainty that his sacrifice was temporary, because Emma's talent would lift their entire family out of struggle. Then David got into MIT on academic scholarship, but chose a local state school instead because leaving would mean Emma losing her built-in support system during the most critical years of her training. She begged him to go, insisted she'd be fine, but he stayed, convinced that family meant showing up even when it cost you opportunities. By 22, Emma was dancing professionally with a small but respected company in Manhattan, making barely enough to survive but radiant with purpose, while David worked in tech support and took night classes toward his computer science degree. They shared a tiny apartment in Brooklyn where the heat barely worked, and the neighbors fought loud enough to vibrate the walls. But they were happy in the way people are happy when they're building towards something together. Emma would practice in their cramped living room. David would code on a laptop balanced on his knees, and they'd order cheap takeout on Fridays and talk about the future like it was a promise they'd made to each other. Then came the accident on a Tuesday in March, Emma driving home from a late rehearsal, when a drunk driver ran a red light and turned her world into metal and glass, and the sickening sound of vertebrae compressing beyond repair. David got the call at 11:47 at night, arrived at the hospital at 12:32, and sat in a waiting room with fluorescent lights that hummed like accusations, until a doctor with exhausted eyes told him his sister would never dance again, would likely never walk again, that the damage to her spinal cord was catastrophic and irreversible. Emma was 22 years old, and in one moment of someone else's carelessness, the future they'd been building together disappeared. The next 2 years were a blur of hospital beds and physical therapy, and insurance battles, and Emma's silent devastation that was somehow worse than if she'd screamed. David moved her into his apartment, converted the living room into accessible space, quit his job to become her full-time caregiver, burning through his minimal savings while Emma went through the stages of grief for the body that had betrayed her and the dream that died with her ability to stand on point. He was there for every session with physical therapists who offered cautious hope about regaining some mobility, there for every night when she cried so hard she couldn't breathe, there for the morning she told him she wished she'd died in the accident because living without dance felt like being buried alive. David held her through that darkness with the same fierce loyalty he'd shown carrying her ballet bag home from practice when they were kids, believing that if he just stayed present enough, loved her hard enough, showed up consistently enough, she'd find a way through the grief to something resembling life again. He took a job at a startup that let him work remotely so he could maintain Emma's care schedule, waking at 5 every morning to help her with exercises before his workday started, eating lunch while researching experimental treatments, spending evenings reading to her from books about dancers who'd overcome injuries, even though they both knew her injury wasn't the kind you overcame. His own life became a footnote to hers, his own dreams deferred indefinitely, and for those 2 years he told himself he was fine with that because this was what love looked like, what family meant, what promises required. Then at 25, after Emma had made enough progress to manage most daily activities with adaptive equipment, after she'd started exploring digital art as a new creative outlet, after the worst of the crisis had passed into something resembling sustainable routine, David received an offer that would change everything. A venture capital firm had noticed his work at the startup, wanted to invest $20 million in his ideas about data analytics, but the deal came with non-negotiable terms, including relocating to Singapore for 3 years to establish Asian market presence. 3 years away from Emma, just when she'd learned to navigate life in a wheelchair, just when their routine had become the scaffolding holding her fragile stability together, just when leaving felt like the cruelest possible betrayal of everything he'd sacrificed to keep her safe. He sat with that offer for 2 weeks, the number 20 million echoing in his mind like a siren song, whispering that this was his one chance to escape the exhaustion of caretaking, to finally build the future he'd deferred, to prove that all those sacrifices hadn't been for nothing, because now he could transform them into the kind of success that justified the cost. Emma knew something was wrong before he told her, could read the conflict in his avoidance of eye contact, and when he finally showed her the offer letter, she went very still in her wheelchair and asked the question that would haunt him for the next 5 years. If you go, do I still matter to you? Or was I just a project you needed to complete before moving on to more important things? David told himself he'd only be gone 3 years, that the money would let him hire the best caregivers for Emma, that he'd visit every few months, that this was actually the responsible choice because financial security meant Emma would never have to worry about affording treatments or equipment or anything she needed for the rest of her life. He said these things out loud to Emma in their tiny Brooklyn apartment, his suitcase already packed in the corner like a verdict already delivered, and she listened with the kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from the soul-deep exhaustion of realizing that someone you love has already made their choice and is just performing the conversation for appearance. She didn't cry or yell or beg him to stay the way he'd half expected, and maybe even hoped she would, because at least that would have given him something concrete to push against, a reason to feel justified in his decision. Instead, she just asked him one question. Do you remember the day after the accident when I told you I wished I'd died, and you held my hand and promised you'd be there every single day until I found a reason to want to live again? And do you remember that the reason I eventually found was knowing that at least one person in the world chose me over everything else? David felt something crack inside his chest, but he'd already mentally committed to Singapore, already started imagining the life where he wasn't defined by someone else's tragedy, already tasted the freedom of being just himself instead of Emma's keeper. And that taste was too intoxicating to spit out even though he knew it was poison. He left on a Sunday morning, hugged Emma in a way that felt like a funeral, promised to call every week, and boarded a plane carrying nothing but ambition and a suitcase full of clothes he'd bought specifically for his new life as a man unencumbered by obligation. For the first 6 months he did call weekly, stilted conversations where he talked about market expansion, and she talked about her digital art projects, and neither of them mentioned the elephant sitting on both their chests, which was that he'd abandoned her the moment it became convenient to do so. Then the calls became bi-weekly, then monthly, then only on birthdays and Christmas, not because he was too busy, but because hearing her voice made him feel things he'd worked very hard to stop feeling, primarily the suffocating guilt of knowing he'd broken the one promise that actually mattered. He sent money instead, generous amounts deposited automatically into her account on the 1st of every month, and he told himself this was love, this was support, this was him taking care of her in the way that actually made practical sense. The money piled up in Emma's account untouched because she'd rather eat ramen and live in a studio apartment the size of a closet than accept what felt like blood money, payment for the brother she'd lost to his own ambition. David thrived in Singapore in all the ways that look impressive on paper, turned that 20 million into 200 million in 18 months, got profiled in business magazines as a visionary, built a reputation as someone who could see market opportunities others missed, which was ironic because he'd completely missed that the most valuable thing in his life was the sister he'd left in a wheelchair in Brooklyn. He dated occasionally, high-achieving women who fit into his new life of rooftop bars and private clubs and conversations about disruption and scale. But nothing lasted longer than a few months, because the moment anyone got close enough to ask about his family, he'd ghost them with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made ghosting into an art form. 3 years in Singapore became 5 because there was always another deal, another opportunity, another reason to avoid going back to face what he'd done. Then he met Victoria at a charity gala in Manhattan, during one of his rare visits back to the States, and she was everything Emma wasn't. Tall, where Emma was petite, able-bodied, where Emma used a wheelchair, obsessed with image, where Emma had learned to stop caring what anyone thought. And most importantly, she knew nothing about his past, which meant she couldn't judge him for it. Victoria was an influencer with millions of followers who documented her life in carefully curated posts that made everything look effortless and beautiful. And David saw in her the perfect camouflage for his own carefully constructed persona. She saw in him the ultimate accessory to her brand, a billionaire boyfriend who could elevate her from lifestyle influencer to serious entrepreneur adjacent. They fell not in love, but into mutual agreement, a relationship that looked perfect in photos and felt empty in private, which suited David fine because empty meant no one could see the parts of him that were broken. 6 months later, he proposed with a ring that cost more than his and Emma's childhood home, at a restaurant with a 6-month waiting list, with a photographer hidden nearby to capture Victoria's perfectly surprised expression for her Instagram feed. The engagement post got 2.3 million likes, and exactly 0 congratulations from Emma, because David hadn't spoken to his sister in over a year at that point, and she only found out he was getting married when one of her few remaining friends sent her a screenshot of the announcement. Emma stared at that photo for a long time, at her brother who looked successful and hollow in equal measure, kneeling before a woman whose smile didn't reach her eyes, and she felt not anger, but profound sadness for what David had traded his humanity to acquire. When the wedding invitation arrived at her apartment 3 months before the ceremony, forwarded through David's lawyer, because he didn't actually have her current address, Emma held that heavy cardstock with its embossed gold lettering and debated whether to respond at all. The invitation was clearly perfunctory, sent to check a box, accompanied by a note from the lawyer explaining that accommodations would be made for her accessibility needs and a caregiver could be provided if required, every word dripping with the kind of clinical efficiency that removes humanity from interaction. Emma could have ignored it, could have let David have his perfect Instagram wedding without the inconvenient reminder of the sister he'd abandoned, but something in her refused to let him off that easy. She RSVP'd yes, arranged her own transportation, refused the offered caregiver, and spent the weeks leading up to the wedding preparing not for revenge but for truth, because she'd learned during 5 years of his absence that the only person you can control is yourself, and the only closure that matters is the kind you give yourself. She arrived at that $2 million venue in her wheelchair, wearing a dress she'd designed herself, because fashion for wheelchair users is notoriously terrible, and she positioned herself exactly where the seating chart indicated, in the back corner farthest from the photographer's main sight lines, and she watched her brother marry a stranger while surrounded by strangers, and she understood with crystalline clarity that he'd gotten exactly what he'd chosen and lost everything that actually mattered in the process. Here's what I need to know. If your siblings sacrificed years of their own dreams to take care of you when you needed it most, could you ever forgive them for leaving the moment it became inconvenient? Or would that betrayal be too fundamental to overcome? Drop your honest answer in the comments. The reception was exactly what $2 million could buy, a symphony of excess designed to photograph beautifully and feel empty in person. Victoria's 7 bridesmaids gave speeches about her beauty, her influence, her inspiring journey from small-town girl to Instagram royalty, each toast more superficial than the last, celebrating a version of her that existed only in filtered photos and carefully edited captions. David's side of the room remained conspicuously silent when the master of ceremonies asked if any family wanted to share memories of the groom, the awkward pause filled only by the clink of champagne glasses and uncomfortable shifting in seats that cost $200 each to rent. Then Emma raised her hand, the mechanical whir of her wheelchair cutting through the orchestrated ambiance like a knife through silk, and 300 heads turned to watch her navigate through tables laden with centerpieces that cost more than her monthly rent. David felt his throat close as Emma positioned herself at the microphone, her presence suddenly making the cavernous ballroom feel suffocatingly small, every eye in the room watching this unexpected disruption to the carefully choreographed evening. Victoria leaned toward him, whispering urgently that this wasn't in the program, her primary concern being how this would affect the videographer's timeline. And David realized with devastating clarity that his wife's first instinct wasn't curiosity about his sister, but annoyance about the schedule. Emma adjusted the microphone down to her seated height with practiced efficiency, and when she spoke, her voice was steady and clear, no tremor of nervousness or anger, just the calm certainty of someone who'd spent 5 years deciding exactly what she needed to say. She started with a story from their childhood, about how David at 12 had sold his only valuable possession, a signed baseball card he'd treasured for years, to buy her first pair of professional ballet shoes when their parents couldn't afford them. How he'd attended every single one of her recitals even when it meant missing his own school events. How he'd promised her when she was scared before her first major performance that he'd always be in the audience cheering for her no matter what. The room relaxed slightly, guests smiling at what seemed like a sweet sibling tribute, Victoria's tension easing as she assumed this would be brief and sentimental and perfectly Instagram appropriate. Then Emma's tone shifted almost imperceptibly, and she continued. He kept that promise faithfully for years, showed up for every performance, every competition, every milestone. Even after our parents died and he became the only family I had left. Even after my accident when I lost the ability to dance and he became my caregiver, waking up at 5 every morning to help me through exercises before going to work, reading me articles about adaptive sports when I was too depressed to care, holding my hand through the darkest year of my life when I genuinely wanted to stop existing. The room went very quiet, the kind of silence that feels like pressure building. Guests, suddenly aware they were witnessing something real, puncture the carefully maintained illusion of the evening. Emma didn't pause, didn't look at David, just kept speaking with surgical precision. And then he received an offer to move to Singapore for 3 years, an opportunity that would make him wealthy beyond anything we'd imagined growing up poor in Queens. And I asked him if he remembered promising to be there every day, until I found reasons to want to live again. And he said yes, he remembered. And then he left anyway because apparently promises have expiration dates that coincide with inconvenience. David couldn't breathe, couldn't move, trapped in his chair while his sister calmly dismantled the narrative he'd constructed about himself as a self-made success who'd done what was necessary. Victoria's face had gone pale, her hand gripping his arm not in support but in barely contained fury, that her perfect wedding was being hijacked by his damaged family drama. Emma continued, He sent me over $230,000 in the 5 years since he left, monthly deposits like clockwork, because David has always been very good at fulfilling obligations that can be automated, and today is the first time I've seen my brother in person since he chose his career over his promise, since he decided that being present in my life was worth less than being successful in his. Several guests were crying now, not the performative tears of a beautiful ceremony, but the uncomfortable tears of witnessing someone's carefully hidden truth being exposed under bright lights. Emma finally looked directly at David, and her eyes held not hatred but something far more devastating, profound sadness mixed with acceptance. I didn't come here to ruin your wedding, David. I came because despite everything, you're still my brother, and I wanted you to know that I survived your abandonment, built a life without you, learned that people who love you conditionally based on convenience aren't actually people you need. I came to tell you that I forgive you, not because you've earned it, but because holding on to anger at someone who's already hollow would only hollow me out too. And I've worked too hard rebuilding myself to let your choices continue defining my story. She paused, let that sink in, then delivered her final line. But I also came to tell you that this is the last time you'll see me, because I'm choosing to walk away from you before you can abandon me again. And unlike you, when I make a promise to myself, I keep it. Emma left the ballroom in her wheelchair without waiting for a response. The mechanical hum of her exit, the only sound in a room full of people too stunned to speak, and David sat frozen at the head table, realizing that 300 witnesses had just watched him be exposed as exactly what he'd become, a man who'd traded his soul for success and called it ambition. Victoria turned to him with ice in her voice, demanding to know why he'd never mentioned his disabled sister, why he'd let this embarrassment happen at their wedding, her words confirming what Emma had just revealed, that he'd surrounded himself with people incapable of seeing him as anything other than an asset to be leveraged or a liability to be managed. The reception continued mechanically because $2 million had been spent, and the photographer still needed golden hour shots, and the band still had 3 hours on their contract. But everything had changed. The veneer of perfection cracked beyond repair. guests whispering and avoiding David's eyes while pretending to enjoy overpriced food that now tasted like ash. That night, in the honeymoon suite that cost $15,000, Victoria scrolled through social media furiously, trying to control the narrative as videos of Emma's speech had already gone viral, millions of views and comments debating whether the sister was brave or cruel, whether David was victim or villain, none of them understanding that both things could be true simultaneously. David didn't sleep, just stared at the ceiling of a room designed for romance and felt the full weight of 5 years of choices he couldn't undo. The marriage lasted 7 months, not because of Emma's speech, but because that speech had forced David to see clearly, for the first time, what he'd been avoiding. He'd married someone as empty as he'd become, built a life that looked impressive in photographs and felt like suffocation in reality, and no amount of money or success could fill the void where his humanity used to live. The divorce was amicable in the way divorces are amicable when two people realize they were never actually married to each other, just to the images they projected. Victoria kept the ring and half his liquid assets. David kept his companies and his carefully constructed loneliness. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, David found himself standing outside Emma's apartment building in Brooklyn, the same building where they'd lived together during her recovery, his hand raised to press her buzzer but frozen with the paralyzing knowledge that he had no right to be there, no words adequate to bridge 5 years of abandonment and a lifetime of broken promises. He pressed it anyway, and when Emma's voice came through the intercom asking who it was, he said simply, "It's David, and I'm not here to ask for forgiveness because I know I don't deserve it. I'm here to ask if you'd let me start showing up, not with money or grand gestures, but just showing up. Because you were right about everything and I need to learn how to be human again, and I don't know how to do that without starting with the person I hurt most." There was a long silence, long enough that David thought she'd just leave him standing there, which would have been deserved. But then the door buzzed open and he climbed 3 flights of stairs that felt like climbing out of a grave he'd dug himself. Emma opened her apartment door, and for the first time in 5 years they looked at each other without cameras or audiences or pretense, just two people who used to be everything to each other before one of them chose to become nothing. She didn't smile or welcome him in, just said, "You get one chance, David. You show up every week, no excuses, no cancellations, no checks to replace presents. And if you miss even 1 week without a reason that involves actual emergency, you never come back. Because I've already survived you leaving once and I won't survive it again." David nodded, understanding that this wasn't forgiveness but an opportunity to earn something much harder, and he stepped into her small apartment that was worth less than his wedding flowers had cost, and felt more at home than he'd felt in 5 years of luxury. They sat in her tiny living room surrounded by her digital art and second-hand furniture, and they didn't talk about the past, or the wedding, or the years between. They just sat in uncomfortable silence that was at least honest, and David understood that rebuilding wouldn't be a dramatic transformation, but countless small moments of choosing to stay when leaving would be easier, and for the first time since he'd boarded that plane to Singapore, he chose to stay. What relationship in your life have you sacrificed for success? And if you could go back, would you make the same choice? Sometimes the most valuable things we own are the connections we've neglected, and the bravest thing we can do is show up to repair what we've broken. Share your story in the comments below, and if this made you think about someone you need to reconnect with, hit that like button as a reminder to yourself that it's never too late to choose presence over perfection.